The knife was already at her throat when the doors of the great hall swung open. Ilara Voss did not scream. She had learned long ago that screaming only made men press harder. Instead, she stood still, her chin lifted, while the moneylender's guard held the blade steady, and the crowd of pack members watched from the shadows of the stone pillars, whispering to one another, waiting to see if the girl who owed everything would finally break. "Pay the debt," the guard said, "or give the pack what it is owed another way." Behind him, at the high table, sat the elders of the Ashwood pack, their faces carved from the same cold stone as the hall itself. At the center sat Magda Ashwood, the outgoing Luna, a woman whose voice could silence a room without being raised. She lifted one hand, and the guard stepped back, though the blade did not leave the air entirely. "There is another way," Magda said. "There is always another way, for those willing to bow." Ilara's father had died 3 months earlier, and with him had died any hope that the debt his family carried would simply fade with time. It did not fade. It grew, the way debts to powerful packs always grew, swollen with interest and threat, until it became a living thing that followed Ilara through every hour of her day. She had sold her mother's ring. She had sold the small plot of land behind their house. She had worked until her hands bled, taking in mending from wolves who would not so much as look her in the eye. None of it had been enough. Now she stood in the great hall of the Ashwood pack, 19 years old, an Omega with no rank and no protector, and she understood, with the clarity of someone staring into a fire that was about to consume her, that her life was no longer entirely her own. "Name your price," she said, and her voice did not shake, though everything inside her did. Magda smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "My son needs a wife. You will provide the debt a body to erase it with. Marry Cade, and your family's name is clean." A ripple of laughter moved through the hall, quiet at first, then bolder as more voices joined it. Somewhere near the back, a young wolf named Priya Ashwood laughed loudest of all, her hand pressed to her mouth in mock politeness, her eyes bright with cruelty. Cade Ashwood, the pack's alpha heir, was said to be the strongest wolf born to the pack in 3 generations. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a temper that had already earned him a reputation on the northern border, where he had driven back 2 rival packs before his 25th birthday. He was everything Ilara was not. He was power. She was debt, given a human shape. "He will never accept me," Ilara said quietly. "He does not need to accept you," Magda answered. "He needs to obey me, and I have decided." Ilara looked past the elders, past the crowd of wolves who had already begun to whisper her fate, as though it were entertainment, and found the one person in the hall who was not laughing. Cade stood near a side door, arms crossed, jaw tight, staring at his mother with an expression that was not quite anger, and not quite resignation. He had not asked for this, any more than Ilara had, but when his eyes finally moved to hers, there was no warmth in them. Only the cold, assessing look of a man taking stock of an obstacle that had been placed in his path. 7 days, Magda announced, rising from her seat. "The wedding will be held in 7 days. The debt of the Voss family will be considered paid in full the moment the vows are spoken." The crowd began to disperse, still murmuring, still smiling behind their hands. Ilara stood alone in the center of the hall, the guard finally lowering his blade, the echo of laughter still hanging in the rafters above her like smoke that refused to clear. She walked home that night through streets that smelled of rain and wood smoke, past the houses of families who had once been her neighbors and were now strangers who looked away when she passed. Her own house was small and dark, the fire long since gone out, the shelves nearly bare. She sat at the table where her father used to sit, and pressed her palms flat against the wood, as if she could draw some steadiness from the grain of it. "You would have hated this," she whispered into the empty room. "You would have fought them." But her father was gone, and fighting was not a thing available to her. Only bending, only surviving. She had spent her whole life learning how to survive quietly, how to make herself small enough that trouble passed over her, and now trouble had found her anyway, wearing the shape of a wedding gown. The 7 days passed like water through her fingers, impossible to hold on to, impossible to slow. On the 2nd day, a seamstress arrived at her door, sent by the pack, and fitted her for a plain gray dress. the kind given to servants rather than brides. On the fourth day, Priya visited uninvited, walking through Alara's small house with open disdain, running a finger along the dusty shelves, and remarking, loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, that it was a wonder the Voss family had lasted this long without falling into the gutter entirely. "You should be grateful," Priya said, settling herself into the single good chair without being asked. "Most debt-born Omegas end up sold to traveling packs, passed from hand to hand until nobody remembers their names. Instead, you get to marry an alpha heir. Some girls would kill for the chance." "I did not ask for this chance," Alara said. Priya's smile sharpened. "No, but you will take it, because you have no choice, and Cade will resent you for it every single day, because he has no choice either. It will be a very interesting marriage to watch." She left without another word, and Alara stood in the doorway long after she was gone, watching the dust settle back into the shape of the room, feeling the full weight of what was coming. On the sixth day, she finally saw Cade again, not by design but by accident, in the market square where she had gone to buy the last of what little food she could afford. He was standing near the well, speaking with two other wolves, his back straight, his voice low and commanding, in a way that made the men around him lean in to listen. He had not seen her yet. For a moment, Alara allowed herself simply to look at him, to try to understand the shape of the life she was about to be bound to. He was handsome in the way that powerful men often were, not because his features were especially fine, but because he carried himself as though the world had always made room for him. There was a scar along his jaw, thin and pale, earned in some border skirmish, the whole pack still talked about. His eyes, when they finally found her across the square, were sharp and unreadable, and for one long moment neither of them moved. Then he turned back to the men beside him and continued his conversation, as though she were not there at all. It should not have hurt. She barely knew him, and yet something in her chest tightened at the dismissal, some small and foolish part of her that had hoped, even now, even after everything, that the man she was about to marry might look at her with something other than indifference. She walked home with her small bundle of food and did not look back. The seventh day arrived gray and cold, with a mist clinging to the hills around the packlands that made the whole world feel unfinished, as though it too were unsure whether this wedding should happen at all. Alara dressed alone. There was no mother to help her, no sister to braid her hair, no friend to whisper encouragement. She fastened the plain gray dress herself, twisted her dark hair into a simple knot, and looked at her reflection in the cracked mirror that had once belonged to her mother. "You are not nothing," she told the reflection, though she did not entirely believe it. "You are still standing. That has to count for something." The walk to the great hall felt longer than it ever had before, though the distance had not changed. Wolves lined the streets, drawn by curiosity and cruelty in equal measure, come to watch the debt-born Omega walk to her wedding the way one might come to watch a public punishment. Someone threw a wilted flower at her feet, meant as an insult rather than a blessing. Someone else called out that she should be grateful the Ashwoods had not simply thrown her family out onto the road. Alara kept her eyes forward, and her spine straight, and she did not let a single one of them see her flinch. The hall was full when she arrived. Every bench, every alcove, every space along the walls was crowded with pack members, eager to witness the spectacle. Magda stood at the front, near the officiant, her expression composed and satisfied. Priya stood close by, arms crossed, a small, knowing smile on her lips. And at the altar stood Cade, dressed in formal black, his face a mask of controlled patience, the kind of expression a man wears when he has already decided that showing anything else would be a weakness he cannot afford. Alara walked the length of the hall alone. No one stood to escort her. The whispers followed her like a current, rising and falling with every step, and she caught fragments of them as she passed. "Look at her," someone murmured. "Doesn't even own a proper dress." Another voice, sharper, added, "I give it a year before he sets her aside entirely." Somewhere behind her, quiet laughter rippled through a cluster of young wolves who had gathered simply to watch someone else's humiliation. She reached the altar and stood beside Cade, close enough to feel the tension radiating off him, though he did not look at her. The officiant began the ceremony, his voice droning through words that felt as though they belonged to someone else's life. Alara answered when required. Her voice did not shake, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her dress, were pressed together so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. When it came time to exchange vows, Cade spoke his in a flat, even tone, the words correct but hollow, a duty performed rather than a promise made. Elara spoke hers the same way, unwilling to give the watching crowd the satisfaction of hearing her voice break. "By pack law and pack blood," the officiant finally said, "I declare this union bound. The debt of the House of Voss is paid." A ripple of applause moved through the hall, polite and performative, the kind of applause given not out of joy, but out of obligation. Somewhere near the back, someone laughed outright, a short, ugly sound quickly swallowed by the crowd's murmuring approval. Magda stepped forward and placed a hand on each of their shoulders, more a gesture of ownership than blessing. "Welcome to the Ashwood pack," she said to Elara, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Try not to embarrass us." More laughter. Elara felt her face grow hot, but she kept her chin lifted, kept her eyes forward, kept every ounce of humiliation locked deep inside, where none of them could see it feeding. Cade finally turned to look at her then, for the first time since the ceremony had begun. Whatever he saw in her face made something flicker briefly behind his own controlled expression, something that might have been curiosity, or might have simply been surprise that she had not yet cried. He said nothing. He offered his arm, as tradition required, and she took it, and together they walked back down the aisle, as husband and wife, past a crowd that watched them go with expressions ranging from amusement to open contempt. Outside, the mist had not lifted. It clung to the hall's stone steps, softening the edges of the world, and for one strange moment, as they stood together at the top of those steps with the crowd spilling out behind them, Elara felt as though she and Cade were the only two solid things in a landscape made of fog. "This was not my choice," Cade said quietly, the first words he had spoken directly to her all day. "I know," Elara answered. "It was not mine either." He studied her for a long moment, and something in his gaze sharpened, as though he had expected bitterness or tears, and found instead a strange, steady composure that did not fit the story the pack had already told about her. "You did not cry," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I have had a great deal of practice not crying," Elara said. "It is not a skill I am proud of, but it is useful today." Something almost like respect passed briefly across his face before he shuttered it away again, and without another word, he turned and began walking toward the pack house, leaving her to follow or not, as she chose. She followed, because there was nowhere else for her to go, because the small house that had once been her father's now belonged, by the terms of the debt, to someone else entirely, and because whatever waited for her in the Ashwood pack house, however cold, however cruel, was now the only home she had left. Behind them, the crowd continued to murmur, already reshaping the day's events into a story they would tell for years, a story about a debt-born Omega who had married far above her station and would surely, everyone agreed, be sent back to nothing within the year. None of them noticed the way Cade had glanced back at her twice on the walk to the pack house, or the way Elara, despite everything, had not once looked away from the road ahead, walking into her new life with the same quiet, unbroken steadiness that had carried her through every hard year before it. The mist finally began to lift as they reached the gates of the pack house, revealing, high above the hills, the first thin line of gray morning light. It was not much. It was not warmth, and it was not welcome. But it was a beginning, and Elara Voss, now Elara Ashwood in name if nothing else, walked into it with her head held high, unaware that everything the pack believed about her that day was about to be proven completely and utterly wrong. Inside the pack house, the halls were quiet, the servants already whispering about the new arrival before she had even crossed the threshold. Cade led her through corridors lined with portraits of Ashwood ancestors, each one more severe than the last, until they reached a small room at the end of a narrow hallway, far from the grand chambers reserved for the family. "This will be your room," he said, opening the door to reveal a space barely large enough for a bed and a chest of drawers. "I have my own quarters. This marriage exists on paper, nothing more." "I did not expect anything more," Elara said, and she meant it, though something in her chest still ached at the bluntness of it. He nodded once, as though her answer confirmed something he had already decided about her, and then he left without another word, his footsteps fading down the hallway until the house fell silent around her. Elara set down the small bundle of belongings she had carried from her old life and sat on the edge of the narrow bed, looking around at the bare walls of the room that was now, apparently, her entire world. Somewhere in the house, she could hear the faint sound of laughter, servants gossiping about the wedding, about the debt-born girl who had married the alpha heir and been given nothing but a servant's room for her trouble. She did not cry. She had told Cade the truth about that, but she sat very still for a long time, staring at the small window that let in the last gray light of the day, and she made herself a promise, quiet and fierce, the kind of promise that does not need to be spoken aloud to be real. She would not be broken by this. Whatever the Ashwood pack thought of her, whatever they believed she was worth, she would prove them wrong. One day, one small act of quiet strength at a time, until even the ones laughing loudest today would have no choice but to see her clearly. Outside, the last of the mist finally cleared from the hills, and the first star of the evening appeared above the pack house, small and steady, exactly the way Elara intended to be. The scream came from the kitchen just after dawn, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet of the pack house like a blade. Elara was already awake, had barely slept in her narrow servant's room, and she was on her feet and moving toward the sound before she had even decided to move. She reached the kitchen to find a young pack member, a boy no older than 12 named Toby, clutching his hand against his chest, blood welling between his fingers, where a kitchen blade had slipped and caught him. Two older servants stood nearby, frozen, unsure what to do, while the boy's face had gone pale with shock. "Sit him down," Elara said, and something in her voice, calm and certain, cut through the servant's panic. "Now, head lower than his heart, and someone bring clean cloth and water." They obeyed her without question, too startled by her steadiness to argue, and within moments, Elara had the boy seated, his injured hand elevated and wrapped tightly enough to slow the bleeding, but not so tight as to cut off the blood flow entirely. She spoke to him gently the whole time, asking him questions about his favorite games, his favorite foods, anything to keep his mind away from the wound and the fear rising in his eyes. "You did not even flinch," one of the older servants said, watching her work. "How did you learn to do that?" "My father was often injured on hunts," Elara said simply, tying off the last of the bandage. "Someone had to learn how to stop the bleeding." By the time the pack healer arrived, summoned by a servant who had finally found the sense to run for help, the worst of the danger had already passed. The healer examined Elara's work, raised an eyebrow, and said nothing, though the look on his face suggested he was quietly impressed. Word of the incident spread through the pack house before midday, as such things always did, though the story shifted with every retelling. By the time it reached Priya, it had become a tale of the debt-born Omega-playing healer, likely to make herself seem important, likely hoping someone would notice her and feel sorry for her. "She probably staged the whole thing," Priya said to a cluster of young wolves gathered near the training yard, loud enough that she clearly intended the words to travel. "Cut the boy herself, just to have an excuse to be useful." Elara heard the accusation from the hallway outside, and said nothing, only continued on toward the small room she had been given, her jaw tight, her hands curled into fists at her sides. It would have been easy to argue, to defend herself, to demand that someone check the boy's account of what had actually happened. But she had learned long ago that defending herself against people determined to believe the worst rarely accomplished anything except giving them more to talk about. Instead, she returned to the room that was now her home and found, waiting on the narrow bed, a folded list in unfamiliar handwriting. It was a list of chores, lengthy and detailed, everything from scrubbing the kitchen floors to mending torn linens, to hauling water from the well twice a day. At the bottom, in the same careful hand, was written a single line: "The Luna's wife works for her place in this house, the same as anyone else." Elara did not need to ask who had left it. She folded the list and tucked it into the pocket of her dress, and began the first task before the sun had fully risen over the hills. The days that followed settled into a punishing rhythm. Elara rose before dawn and worked until well after dark, scrubbing floors that were already clean, mending linens that did not need mending, hauling water until her shoulders ached, and her palms grew raw and calloused. The other servants watched her with a mixture of pity and wariness, unsure whether to treat her as one of their own or as the alpha's wife. And so, mostly, they treated her as neither, leaving her to work in a strange, isolated silence. Cade she saw rarely, and when she did see him, he offered little more than a nod, before disappearing into meetings with the pack elders, or riding out to inspect the northern border, where tensions with a neighboring pack had been simmering for months. He did not ask about her days, he did not seem to notice, or perhaps did not care to notice, the growing list of chores that kept her busy from dawn until well past dusk. It was Priya who made her days hardest. She seemed to take a particular pleasure in finding new ways to remind Elara of her place, arriving unannounced to inspect her work with exaggerated disappointment, suggesting to the other servants that Elara's cleaning was never quite thorough enough, that her mending was clumsy, that she moved through the house like someone who did not truly belong there. "You should have refused the marriage," Priya said one afternoon, finding Elara on her knees, scrubbing the entrance hall floor. "Better to be poor and free than married and owned. But I suppose debt does not leave much room for pride." Elara did not look up from her work. "I did what was necessary to protect my family's name. I do not regret it." "You will," Priya said, and there was something almost gleeful in her voice. "Cade does not love you. He will never love you. And when he finally tires of this arrangement, you will have nothing left, not even the little you started with." She left without waiting for a response, her footsteps light and satisfied on the polished floor, and Elara continued scrubbing long after the sound of them had faded, refusing to let the words settle anywhere they could take root. It was nearly 3 weeks into her marriage, when the border tensions Cade had been managing finally erupted into open conflict. A rival pack, the Thornfield Wolves, had grown bold enough to cross into Ashwood territory, testing the strength of the borders in ways that could not be ignored. Cade rode out with a small company of warriors to answer the challenge, and the pack house fell into an anxious hush as word spread of the confrontation. Elara was in the kitchen, helping prepare food for the warriors who would return, when the first of them came stumbling through the door, supporting a comrade whose arm hung useless and bleeding at his side. Behind them came more wounded, the sounds of the skirmish still audible in the low murmur of pained voices and hurried footsteps. The pack healer, overwhelmed almost immediately by the number of injuries, called for anyone with steady hands to help, and Elara did not hesitate. She moved among the wounded, with the same calm certainty she had shown with the boy in the kitchen weeks earlier, cleaning wounds, applying pressure, calling out clearly for supplies when they were needed, never once flinching at the blood or the pain around her. It was in the middle of this chaos that Cade himself was brought in, a deep gash along his ribs where a Thornfield blade had found its mark. He was conscious but pale, his jaw clenched against the pain, and the healer, already stretched too thin among the other wounded, glanced toward Elara. "Can you handle a wound like this?" the healer asked, already moving toward another patient whose injuries were more urgent. "Yes," Elara said, though her heart had begun to pound the moment she saw Cade's face, pale and strained on the makeshift table before her. She worked quickly, cleaning the wound with practiced hands, her voice low and steady as she spoke to him the way she had spoken to the frightened boy weeks earlier, though this time the words felt different, carried a weight she did not entirely understand. "You are lucky," she said, threading the needle the healer had left with her. "A little deeper, and this would have been far worse." "You do not sound particularly worried," Cade said through gritted teeth, watching her work with an expression that was difficult to read. "I am worried," Elara said honestly, not looking up from the wound. "But panicking will not help either of us. Hold still." He obeyed, watching her the entire time, his sharp eyes tracking the movement of her hands with something that looked less like pain now and more like quiet astonishment. When she finished, tying off the last stitch with the same care she had shown throughout, he let out a slow breath and finally allowed himself to relax against the table. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "My father was a hunter before the debt took everything from us," Elara said, cleaning the last of the blood from his side. "He was injured often. Someone had to learn to help him." Cade was quiet for a long moment, studying her face, as though seeing her clearly for the first time since the wedding. "The pack believes you are helpless, that you brought nothing to this marriage, but a debt that needed erasing. The pack believes a great many things, Ilara said, finally meeting his eyes. Most of them are wrong. Something shifted in his expression then, subtle, but undeniable, the first genuine crack in the cold indifference he had shown her since the day they married. He did not say anything more, but as she finished bandaging the wound and stepped back to let him rest, she caught him watching her a moment longer than necessary, his gaze thoughtful in a way it had never been before. Word of what had happened during the border skirmish spread through the pack house quickly, though this time the story arrived without the usual sneer attached to it. The Alpha heir's wife had stitched his wound herself, steady and calm, while warriors twice her size had needed to look away. Some of the younger pack members began to look at her differently after that, their curiosity replacing some of their contempt, though Priya's hostility only sharpened in response. "Do not think this changes anything," Priya said, cornering Ilara in the hallway outside the healer's quarters a few days later. "One lucky moment does not erase where you came from. Cade will remember his duty soon enough, and you will be exactly what you always were. Nothing." Ilara said nothing in return, only held Priya's gaze until the other woman's confidence wavered, just slightly, just enough for Ilara to notice. She had spent her whole life being underestimated, and for the first time since her wedding day, she allowed herself to wonder if perhaps being underestimated was not entirely a weakness. Perhaps it was simply a kind of armor, one that let her move quietly through a world determined to see her as small, right up until the moment she chose to prove them wrong. That evening, as she returned to her narrow room after another long day of chores, she found Cade waiting near her door, still favoring his injured side slightly, his expression unreadable in the dim hallway light. "Thank you," he said simply, "for the stitches, and for not panicking when everyone around us had." "You are welcome," Ilara said, surprised by the words, by the quiet sincerity in them. He hesitated, as though there was more he wanted to say, and for a moment, the silence between them felt different than it had before, less like the distance of strangers forced together, and more like the careful, uncertain space between two people beginning, slowly, to see each other clearly. "Good night, Ilara," he finally said, and it was the first time he had spoken her name since the wedding. "Good night, Cade," she answered, and as he walked away down the hallway, she found herself watching him go with a feeling she could not quite name, something warmer than the cold indifference she had expected to carry through this marriage, something that felt, cautiously, dangerously, like the very beginning of hope. The letter arrived hidden inside a basket of laundry, and Ilara almost missed it entirely. She found it while sorting linens late one evening, a small folded scrap of paper tucked between two sheets, her name written on the outside in handwriting she did not recognize. She unfolded it carefully, half expecting another cruel note from Priya, but the words inside were different, urgent in a way that made her chest tighten. "Meet me at the old well past the eastern fence, after the house sleeps. Come alone. I know something about your mother that you do not." There was no signature. Ilara read the note 3 times, turning it over in her hands, as though the blank back might reveal who had written it, but there was nothing more. Her mother had died when Ilara was only 6 years old, and the details of her death, and of her life before that, had always been vague, spoken of rarely and only in fragments by her father, who had carried his grief too heavily to share it easily. She should have shown the note to someone. She should have been cautious. But something about the words, "Know something about your mother," pulled at a part of her that had spent 13 years wondering about the mother she barely remembered, and against every instinct for caution she had built over years of survival, Ilara found herself slipping out of the pack house after dark, moving quietly through the shadows toward the eastern fence. The old well stood at the edge of Ashwood territory, long since dry and mostly forgotten, surrounded by overgrown grass and the skeletal shapes of trees that had not seen care in years. A figure waited there in the moonlight, cloaked and hooded, and Ilara stopped several paces away, every instinct suddenly screaming caution. "Who are you?" she asked, keeping her voice low. The figure lowered the hood, revealing the weathered face of an elderly woman, her eyes sharp despite her age, her expression grave. "My name is Ilsa. I served your mother many years ago, before she came to this territory." "My mother never lived here," Ilara said. "She grew up 2 territories east, in a small farming pack. My father told me so. Your father told you what he believed to be true, Ilsa said. And perhaps what he believed was safest for you to know. But your mother did not come from a small farming pack, Ilara. Your mother was born into the Larkspur line. Ilara felt the ground shift slightly beneath her, though she had not moved. The Larkspur line is a legend, a story, told to pups before bed. There is no Larkspur pack. There has not been in generations. There was, Ilsa said, until it was destroyed. Its Luna line hunted nearly to extinction by rivals, who feared what the bloodline represented. A handful of survivors scattered and hid, changing their names, burying their history so deep that even their own children would not know to look for it. Your mother was one of the last of that line. She hid herself among a farming pack, married quietly, and told no one the truth, because the truth would have made her, and eventually you, a target. Ilara's mind raced, trying to fit this impossible story against the fragments of memory she carried of her mother, a gentle woman with dark hair and a quiet way of humming while she worked, a woman who had died of a sudden fever when Ilara was still small, leaving behind almost nothing except a single ring, long since sold to pay the family's debt. Why are you telling me this now? Ilara asked. Why not before? Because I only recently learned where you had ended up, Ilse said. And because the Larkspur bloodline carries with it certain rights, certain protections, that the Ashwood elders would not dare deny if the truth became known. You are not debt-born nobility's charity case, Ilara. You carry blood older and, in its own way, more powerful than the Ashwoods themselves. I came to tell you this because I believe you deserve to know the truth of who you are, whether or not you choose to use it. Ilara stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the old woman's words settling over her like a heavy cloak. Part of her wanted desperately to believe it, to hold on to some proof that she was not, as the pack believed, nothing more than a debt given a human shape. But another part of her, the cautious part that had survived years of hardship by trusting nothing given too easily, held back. Do you have proof? She asked. Ilsa reached into her cloak and withdrew a small, tarnished pendant, shaped like a curling vine wrapped around a single star, and held it out. This belonged to your mother's family for generations. It is the mark of the Larkspur line. Few would recognize it now, but among the old packs, those who remember the history, it would be enough to confirm what I have told you. Ilara took the pendant carefully, turning it over in her hands. It felt strangely familiar, though she could not say why, as though some deep, forgotten part of her recognized its weight and shape, even if her conscious mind did not. I need time, she said finally. This is a great deal to accept in one night. Of course, Ilsa said, drawing her hood back up, but do not wait too long, child. There are those who would see the Larkspur line ended entirely rather than restored, and word travels faster in these territories than most people realize. Keep the pendant hidden. Trust carefully, and when the time comes to use the truth of who you are, do not hesitate. She disappeared into the darkness before Ilara could ask another question, leaving her alone by the old well with nothing but a tarnished pendant and a story too large to fully comprehend. Ilara made her way back to the pack house in a daze, the pendant tucked carefully into the inner pocket of her dress, pressed against her chest, as though its weight alone might anchor the impossible night into something real. She did not sleep. She lay awake in her narrow bed, turning the pendant over in her fingers in the darkness, trying to reconcile the story Ilsa had told her with the quiet, gentle mother she remembered humming softly while mending clothes by candlelight. The next morning, she went about her chores as though nothing had changed, scrubbing floors and hauling water with the same steady discipline as always, though her mind kept drifting back to the pendant hidden beneath her dress, to the strange, unsettling possibility that she was not who everyone, including herself, had always believed her to be. It was Cade who noticed the shift in her first. You seem distracted, he said, finding her in the garden that afternoon, staring at nothing in particular, while a basket of unweeded vegetables sat forgotten beside her. I am fine, Ilara said quickly, too quickly, and Cade's sharp eyes narrowed slightly, reading the lie beneath her words with the same instinct that had made him such an effective leader on the northern border. You do not have to tell me, he said, settling onto the low garden wall beside her. But you also do not have to pretend everything is fine when it clearly is not. Whatever is troubling you, Elara, I am not the enemy here. Whatever this marriage started as, I do not intend for it to remain only an obligation. It was the most he had said to her about their marriage since the wedding, and something in his voice, sincere and a little uncertain, made Elara's chest tighten with an emotion she had not expected to feel toward him so soon. I received strange news last night, she admitted finally, choosing her words carefully. About my family, about my mother. What kind of news? I am not entirely certain what to make of it yet, Elara said, which was true enough without revealing everything. I need time to understand it myself before I share it with anyone else. Even you. Cade studied her for a long moment, and she braced herself for questions, for suspicion, for the same doubt she had come to expect from nearly everyone in the Ashwood pack. Instead, he simply nodded. Take the time you need, he said, but know that when you are ready to share it, I will listen. I have spent the last several weeks assuming you were exactly what my mother told me you were. I am beginning to think that was a mistake. He rose from the garden wall and walked back toward the house, leaving Elara alone, with the vegetables and the pendant hidden against her heart, and the strange, unfamiliar warmth of being seen, perhaps for the first time since her father's death, by someone who was genuinely trying to understand her. But the peace of that moment did not last long. That evening, as Elara returned from the well with 2 heavy buckets of water, she found Priya waiting near the kitchen entrance, arms crossed, an expression of calculated curiosity on her face. You were seen, Priya said without preamble, sneaking out past the eastern fence last night. Meeting with someone in secret. Care to explain what a debt-born Omega has to hide from her own pack? Elara's stomach dropped, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, setting down the water buckets with deliberate calm. I could not sleep. I went for a walk. A walk that took you past the fence, in the dark, to meet with a hooded stranger. Priya's eyes gleamed with something dangerous. That is quite a walk. I wonder what the pack elders would think, knowing their new Luna's wife is sneaking around in secret so soon after her wedding. It does raise questions, does it not? About loyalty, about what exactly she might be planning. I am not planning anything, Elara said, keeping her voice steady despite the cold fear beginning to spread through her chest. You are seeing conspiracy where there is none. Perhaps, Priya said, though her tone made clear she did not believe it for a moment. Or perhaps, I am simply the first to notice what everyone else has been too foolish to see. Either way, I will be watching you very closely from now on, Elara, very closely indeed. She walked away, leaving Elara standing alone in the gathering dusk, the pendant pressed against her chest like a secret that had suddenly become far more dangerous than she had realized, and the first cold thread of dread beginning to wind its way through the fragile, uncertain peace she had only just begun to find within the walls of the Ashwood packhouse. The council chamber fell silent the moment Magda Ashwood rose to her feet, her eyes fixed directly on Elara. There have been reports, Magda said, her voice carrying easily through the stone chamber, of secret meetings outside pack territory. Meetings held in darkness, with strangers, kept hidden from this family and this pack. I would like an explanation. It had been only 2 days since Priya's confrontation outside the kitchen, and Elara had known, with a sinking certainty, that the accusation would not stay quiet for long. She had hoped for more time to understand what Ilsa had told her, time to decide how and whether to reveal the truth of her mother's bloodline before it could be twisted into something dangerous. That time had run out. She stood before the gathered elders in the council chamber, aware of every eye in the room fixed on her, aware of Priya standing near the back with barely concealed satisfaction, aware of Cade seated among the elders, his expression tight and unreadable, as he watched his mother press the attack. I met with someone who knew my mother, Elara said carefully, choosing her words with the same care she used when stitching a wound, precise, deliberate, unwilling to let a single stray movement cause more damage than necessary. There is nothing sinister in it. I sought information about my own family history. That is all. That is all, Magda repeated, her tone dripping with disbelief. A debt-born Omega, married into this pack barely a month, sneaking past the eastern fence in darkness to meet a stranger, And we are meant to believe this is nothing more than idle curiosity about her family tree? It is the truth, Elara said, holding her ground, despite the tightening knot of fear in her chest. Perhaps, Magda said. Or perhaps you are exactly what some of us suspected from the beginning. A girl whose family's debts made her vulnerable to outside influence, willing to sell whatever loyalty she owes this pack to whoever offers the highest price. Thornfield wolves have grown bold on our borders. It would not be the first time an enemy pack used a marriage to plant eyes and ears inside a rival's walls. A murmur of unease moved through the council chamber, and Elara felt the ground shifting beneath her. The careful narrative Magda had constructed taking root among the elders faster than any truth could hope to counter it. She glanced toward Cade, hoping for support, and found him watching his mother with a hard, guarded expression, though he had not yet spoken in Elara's defense. "I have betrayed no one," Elara said, her voice rising slightly, despite her efforts to remain calm. "I have done nothing but work, every single day, to be worthy of a place in this pack that I never asked to join. I have tended your wounded, mended your linens, scrubbed your floors, and asked for nothing in return. If a single quiet conversation about my own mother is enough to condemn me as a traitor, then perhaps the truth does not matter to this council at all." "Careful," Magda said, her voice sharpening. "You speak to the Luna of this pack." "I speak to a woman who decided I was guilty before I ever opened my mouth to defend myself," Elara answered, and though her heart pounded, she did not look away. The chamber fell into a tense, crackling silence, broken finally by Priya's voice, smooth and satisfied, rising from the back of the room. "If she has nothing to hide, let her tell us who she met. Let her bring this mysterious stranger before the council, so we can judge for ourselves whether her story holds any truth at all." It was, Ra'a realized with a cold jolt, exactly the trap she had feared. To reveal Ilsa would be to reveal the pendant, the Larkspur bloodline, everything Ilsa had warned her to keep hidden until she was ready to use it. But to refuse would only deepen the suspicion, already hardening around her like a net drawing tighter. "I do not know how to find her again," Elara said, which was, at least, the truth. "She came to me. I did not seek her out." "Convenient," Priya said, and laughter rippled quietly through parts of the chamber, though it was thinner now, less certain than the laughter that had followed Elara through her wedding day. Magda studied Elara for a long, heavy moment, and Elara had the unsettling sense of being weighed, measured, and found wanting all over again. "Until this matter is resolved," Magda finally said, "you will be confined to the packhouse grounds. No visits beyond the fence, no unsupervised meetings, and any further evidence of contact with outside parties will be treated as proof of betrayal against this pack. Is that understood?" "Understood," Elara said, though the word tasted bitter in her mouth. The council was dismissed, and the elders filed out of the chamber in twos and threes, murmuring among themselves, casting glances back toward Elara that ranged from suspicion to pity to open contempt. Priya lingered longest, her satisfaction barely concealed, before finally following the others out, with a final, triumphant glance in Elara's direction. Cade remained behind after the chamber had emptied, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of everything that had just happened settling heavily between them. "You could have defended me," Elara said finally, unable to keep the hurt from her voice. "You said nothing." "I was watching," Cade said, his voice low and controlled, though something beneath it suggested a temper being carefully restrained. "My mother has wanted a reason to undo this marriage, since before it happened. If I had spoken too forcefully in your defense with no evidence to support it, I would only have confirmed her suspicion that you have already turned me against my own family. I need proof, Elara. Not accusations traded for accusations. Tell me who you met. Tell me what she told you. If it is truly nothing sinister, help me prove it." Elara hesitated, torn between the instinct to protect the secret Ilsa had entrusted her with, and the growing, undeniable need to trust someone within these walls, someone who might actually stand beside her, rather than simply watch her drown. "Not here," she said finally, glancing toward the chamber doors, half expecting Priya to still be listening from some hidden corner. "Not where anyone might hear." Cade nodded, and that evening, After the pack house had settled into its usual nighttime quiet, he came to her small room, closing the door carefully behind him, before turning to face her with the same intense, focused attention he brought to every serious matter. "Tell me everything," he said. And so, finally, Elara did. She told him about the note hidden in the laundry, about the meeting at the old well, about Ilse, and the story of the Larkspur line, a bloodline hunted to the edge of extinction, generations ago, scattered and hidden, its survivors burying their history so deeply that even their own children grew up believing themselves to be nothing more than ordinary. She showed him the pendant, drawing it carefully from where she had kept it hidden against her skin, and watched his expression shift from careful skepticism to something closer to shock as he examined the tarnished vine and star engraved into its surface. "I have read of the Larkspur line," Cade said quietly, turning the pendant over in his hands. "It was taught to me as a child, a cautionary history of a bloodline destroyed by rivals who feared what its Luna line represented. I always believed it to be little more than legend, exaggerated over generations of retelling." "Ilse claims it was real," Elara said, "that my mother was one of the last survivors, hidden away among a farming pack to keep her safe. That the truth of it was buried so deeply that even my father may not have known the full extent of what he was protecting." Cade was silent for a long moment, studying the pendant, studying her, the weight of the revelation settling slowly over his features. "If this is true," he said finally, "it changes everything. The Larkspur line was not simply another bloodline, Elara. It was said to carry a strength, an instinct for leadership, that few packs in this territory could match. If word of your true heritage reached the wrong ears before we could control how it was revealed, it could put you in very real danger, from rivals who fear a Larkspur claim being restored, and from members of this very pack who would see any threat to Ashwood dominance eliminated before it could take root. Then what do we do?" Elara asked, the fear she had been holding at bay finally beginning to show plainly on her face. Cade closed his hand carefully around the pendant and looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Something steady and resolved, the look of a man who had finally decided, fully and without reservation, which side of a coming conflict he intended to stand on. "For now," he said, "we keep this hidden, exactly as Ilse warned you to. We find proof, real, undeniable proof, before we ever bring this before my mother or the council. And in the meantime, Elara, I want you to understand something clearly. Whatever happens next, whatever my mother decides to believe about you, you are not facing this alone anymore. I do not know when it happened, exactly, somewhere between the stitches in my side and the quiet, unshakable way you stood before the council today, but I have stopped seeing you as an obligation. I see you now, all of you, and I intend to stand beside you, whatever comes." Elara felt something in her chest loosen, some tightly held breath she had been carrying since the day of her wedding finally beginning to release. It was not safety, not yet, not with suspicion tightening around her, and a secret bloodline hidden beneath her skin, like a live coal waiting to catch flame. But it was something, a single steady presence in a house that had shown her almost nothing but coldness, and for the first time since she had walked to that altar amid laughter and mockery, Elara allowed herself to believe that perhaps she would not have to face what was coming entirely on her own. 3 weeks passed under the watchful confinement of the council's ruling, and in that time something began to shift quietly within the walls of the Ashwood packhouse, so gradually that even Elara barely noticed it happening until it had already taken root. Cade began seeking her out, not in secret, but openly, walking with her through the gardens in the evenings, sitting beside her during meals rather than at the far end of the table, as he had in the earliest days of their marriage. He asked her questions about her childhood, about the small farming pack where she had grown up, about her father's hunts and her mother's quiet humming, and Elara found herself answering honestly, surprised at how easily the words came when someone was finally, genuinely listening. "You never once complained," Cade said one evening, as they walked slowly along the garden path, the last light of the day fading gold and soft over the hills. "Through all of it, the debt, the wedding, the chores, my mother's cruelty, Priya's schemes. You never once complained to me. Complaining rarely changes anything, Elara said. I learned that a long time ago. It only gives people another reason to believe you are weak. I do not think you are weak, Cade said, stopping on the path to look at her directly. I think you are the strongest person I have ever met, and it has taken me far too long to see it clearly. Elara felt heat rise in her cheeks, unused to such open sincerity, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with something new and fragile, and entirely unlike the cold distance that had once defined their marriage. It was during a border patrol a few days later that Elara witnessed, for the first time, a side of Cade the pack rarely saw. A young pack member, barely more than a boy, had been caught sneaking food from the pack stores to feed his ailing grandmother, who lived on the outskirts of the territory and had fallen too ill to work for her keep. Pack law was strict about theft, even theft born of desperation, and the boy stood trembling before Cade, awaiting a punishment that could have ranged from harsh labor to public shaming. Why did you not simply ask for help? Cade asked, his voice stern but not unkind. I was afraid, the boy admitted, tears welling in his eyes. Afraid you would say no. Afraid everyone would think less of my family. Elara, standing nearby, watched Cade's expression soften slightly, watched him crouch down to the boy's eye level, in a gesture that surprised nearly everyone gathered to witness the judgment. Theft is theft, Cade said, and I cannot simply overlook it, even for a kindness meant toward your grandmother. But desperation born of need is not the same as greed, and this pack should never be a place where a boy fears asking for help more than he fears breaking the law. You will work in the healer's quarters for 2 weeks, helping tend to those who cannot care for themselves, as payment for what was taken. And your grandmother will receive proper food and care from this day forward, without you ever needing to risk yourself again. The boy's tears turned to relief, and as he was led away, Elara caught Cade's eye across the small gathered crowd, and something passed between them, a quiet understanding, an unspoken recognition that they shared more values than either of them had realized when they stood at that altar, as strangers bound only by debt. You defended a boy who broke pack law, Elara said later, as they walked back toward the pack house together. Compassion and justice are not opposites, Cade said. My father taught me that, before he died. I think I forgot it for a while, buried under the weight of trying to be the alpha my mother expected me to become. You have reminded me of it, more than once now, without ever meaning to. It was not long after this that Elara began to notice small acts of care from Cade that went beyond simple courtesy. He arranged for a proper set of dresses to be delivered to her room, quietly, without announcement, so that she would no longer have to wear the same plain gray garment day after day. He ensured that her portion at meals was equal to his own, rather than the meager servings she had grown accustomed to receiving. He began, slowly and without fanfare, to include her in small decisions about the pack house, asking her opinion on matters of household management, listening when she offered suggestions, rather than dismissing them as the elders so often did. Priya noticed the shift as well, and her hostility sharpened in response, though she was careful now to keep her cruelty hidden from Cade's direct notice. She cornered Elara in quiet moments, in hallways and gardens where no one else could overhear, her words growing more pointed with each encounter. You think this changes anything? Priya hissed one afternoon, finding Elara alone in the linen closet. A few kind words, a few new dresses. He is only playing at kindness because he pities you, the same way one might pity an injured animal. The moment something better comes along, someone with real standing, real family, he will remember exactly what you are. Elara had grown practiced enough at ignoring Priya's venom that the words barely stung anymore, though a small, quiet part of her still wondered, in her weaker moments, whether there was truth buried somewhere in the cruelty. But then she would remember the way Cade had knelt before a frightened boy, the way he had listened to her stories of her mother's humming, with genuine interest rather than polite obligation, and the doubt would fade as quickly as it had risen. The true turning point came nearly a month into their strange, evolving arrangement, during a small pack gathering held to celebrate the turning of the season. Such gatherings were traditionally opportunities for the pack to demonstrate unity and strength, and Magda had insisted on a formal display, with the elders seated at the high table and the pack members gathered below to feast and dance beneath strings of lantern light. Ilara had expected to spend the evening in the shadows, as she had every gathering since her wedding, unnoticed and unwelcome among the pack's celebrations. Instead, Cade surprised her by requesting the first dance, offering his hand before the entire assembled pack with an expression of quiet, deliberate confidence that left no room for anyone present to mistake his intention. The hall fell silent as they moved onto the floor together, and Ilara felt the weight of every eye upon them, the same weight she had felt on her wedding day, though this time something had shifted in the quality of the attention. There was less mockery in it now, and more genuine curiosity, as the pack watched their alpha heir dance with the woman he had married under obligation, watched the easy, careful way he held her, the small smile that touched his mouth as she found her footing beside him. "You do not have to do this," Ilara murmured, as they moved through the steps of the dance. "Prove something to them on my behalf." "I am not proving anything to them," Cade said quietly, his eyes not leaving hers. "I am simply no longer willing to hide what I have already decided to be true. You are my wife, Ilara, not by paper alone anymore, but in every way that matters to me. I would like the pack to understand that clearly, before rumor and cruelty can shape their understanding for them." Somewhere near the high table, Magda watched the dance with an unreadable expression, her jaw tight, while Priya's face had gone pale and furious in the lantern light. But for the first time since her wedding, Ilara found she did not care what either of them thought. She was aware only of Cade's hand steady against her own, of the warmth building slowly and undeniably between them, of the quiet, unshakable sense that whatever conspiracies still moved in the shadows of the Ashwood pack, she was no longer facing them from a position of weakness. The dance ended to scattered applause, warmer than anything Ilara had received since arriving at the pack house, and as Cade led her from the floor, his hand still resting lightly at the small of her back, Ilara caught sight of Priya, slipping quietly from the hall, her expression twisted with something far more dangerous than simple jealousy. She did not know it yet, standing there in the golden lantern light with Cade's steady presence beside her, but that quiet departure marked the beginning of a scheme far more dangerous than anything Priya had attempted before, one that would soon threaten not only Ilara's fragile new happiness, but her very place within the Ashwood pack itself. The rider from Thornfield territory arrived at the edge of Ashwood lands, just before midnight, cloaked in shadow, carrying a message that would set in motion the most dangerous scheme the pack had faced in years. Priya met him herself, far from the pack house, in a clearing she had used before for meetings she preferred to keep hidden from prying eyes. The rider, a wolf named Corin who served the Thornfield Alpha directly, dismounted and studied her with open suspicion. "You said you had information that could weaken Ashwood defenses," Corin said. "My Alpha does not appreciate wasted time." "I have something better than information about defenses," Priya said, a cold smile curling across her lips. "I have a way to tear the pack apart from the inside, without a single blade crossing the border. The Alpha heir has married an Omega, with a hidden bloodline claim, one that could someday challenge Ashwood authority entirely, if it were ever confirmed and embraced. If we act carefully, we can make the entire pack believe she is a spy, working on Thornfield's behalf, using her supposed bloodline as a cover story, to weaken Ashwood from within. The pack will turn on her themselves. We will not need to lift a single weapon." Corin considered this for a long moment, his expression calculating. "And what do you gain from tearing apart your own pack's leadership?" "I gain what should have been mine from the beginning," Priya said, her voice sharpening with old, bitter resentment. "I was meant to be considered for Luna before that debt-born girl arrived, and stole the position out from under me, through nothing more than her family's misfortune. Help me discredit her, help me see her cast out or worse, and I will ensure Thornfield gains a foothold within Ashwood leadership that no border skirmish could ever achieve." It was, Corin admitted, an elegant plan, and by the time he rode back toward Thornfield territory before dawn, the arrangement had been sealed. Priya would begin planting the seeds of suspicion, feeding false evidence to the pack elders, while Thornfield would provide the final piece, a forged letter suggesting Ilara had been in direct contact with Thornfield leadership, offering information about Ashwood's border strength in exchange for protection of her supposed bloodline claim. The forged letter arrived at the pack house 3 days later, delivered anonymously and discovered, with careful staging, tucked among Ilara's belongings by a servant loyal to Priya. Word reached the council chamber before Ilara herself even knew the letter existed, and by the time she was summoned before the assembled elders once more, the accusation had already hardened into something the pack was eager to believe. "Explain this," Magda said, her voice cold as she held up the forged letter for the entire chamber to see. "Found hidden among your things, addressed to Thornfield leadership, discussing Ashwood border weaknesses, and offering, in exchange, protection for a claim you have not yet even revealed to this council." Ilara felt the blood drain from her face as she stared at the letter, recognizing immediately that she had never written it, though the handwriting had been forged with unsettling skill. "I did not write this," she said, her voice steady despite the panic rising in her chest. "I have never met with anyone from Thornfield territory. This is a lie." "A convenient denial," Priya said from her place near the council, her expression a careful mask of concern that did not reach her eyes. "Much like the convenient denial about your secret meeting near the eastern fence, weeks ago. A pattern is beginning to emerge, is it not?" The chamber erupted into murmurs, the same murmurs that had followed Ilara through her wedding day, sharpened now with genuine suspicion rather than simple mockery. Ilara searched the crowd for Cade and found him standing near the front, his jaw tight, his eyes moving between her and the letter, with an expression she could not immediately read, and for one terrible moment, fear gripped her, that even he might begin to doubt her. "This letter mentions a bloodline claim," Magda continued, her voice growing sharper. "What claim is this? What have you been hiding from this pack, Ilara?" There was no more room to hide it, no way to keep the secret buried any longer without appearing to confirm every suspicion the forged letter had planted. Ilara reached beneath the collar of her dress and drew out the pendant Ilsa had given her, holding it up before the assembled council, with hands that trembled only slightly. "My mother was born into the Larkspur line," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent chamber. "A bloodline nearly destroyed generations ago, and hidden ever since. I learned of this only recently, from a woman who served my mother's family before I was born. This pendant is proof of that heritage. I did not reveal it sooner, because I feared exactly this, that it would be twisted into evidence of some scheme I have never been part of." The revelation sent a fresh wave of murmurs through the chamber, disbelief mixing now with something closer to genuine shock. Magda stared at the pendant with an expression that flickered, briefly, with something like recognition, before hardening once more into suspicion. "A convenient story," she said, revealed only now, when accused of treachery. "How are we meant to believe a debt-born Omega carries the blood of a legendary line, rather than believing she has fabricated this tale to distract from a very real letter found among her belongings?" "Because it is the truth," Cade said, finally stepping forward, his voice carrying the full weight of his authority through the chamber. "I have seen the pendant myself, weeks ago, along with the account of the woman who brought it to Ilara. I chose not to reveal it before now, because we did not yet have proof strong enough to bring before this council safely. But I will not stand here and watch my wife accused of treachery on the strength of a single unsigned letter, especially not when that letter appears mere days after Thornfield activity has increased along our borders." "You knew of this, and said nothing?" Magda's voice sharpened with fury, though it was directed now as much at her son as at Ilara. "I protected my wife," Cade said, "exactly as any alpha should protect the people under his care. If that is a failing, Mother, then I accept it gladly. But I will not accept a forged letter as proof of betrayal when the timing of its discovery serves someone's interests far more conveniently than it serves the truth." His gaze shifted deliberately toward Priya as he spoke, and something in her expression flickered, just for a moment, a crack in the careful mask of concern she had worn throughout the proceedings. "Are you suggesting," Priya said, her voice rising with indignation, "that I would fabricate evidence against a member of this pack?" "I am suggesting," Cade said, "that this letter is a forgery, and that whoever planted it among Ilara's belongings had access to her room, knowledge of the Thornfield situation, and a clear motive to see her discredited. I intend to find out exactly who that person is, and I would advise them, whoever they are, to consider very carefully what will happen when I do." The chamber fell into tense, uncertain silence, the accusation hanging in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Magda studied her son for a long moment, clearly torn between her instinctive distrust of Ilara and the undeniable logic of Cade's argument, before finally raising a hand to quiet the murmuring elders. "This matter requires investigation before further judgment," she said finally. "The letter will be examined by our scribes for evidence of forgery. Ilara's claim of Larkspur heritage will be investigated through proper channels. Until both matters are resolved, no further accusations will be entertained without evidence stronger than rumor and convenient timing." It was not full vindication, but it was more than Ilara had dared hope for, as she stood trembling before the council, the pendant still clutched tightly in her hand. As the chamber began to empty, she caught sight of Priya slipping away toward a side door, her expression no longer composed, but tight with barely contained fury, and something that looked, unmistakably, like fear. Cade found Ilara moments later, drawing her gently away from the chamber and into a quiet alcove where they could speak without prying ears. "Thank you," Ilara said, her voice unsteady with the aftermath of fear and relief tangled together. "You did not have to defend me so openly." "I told you before," Cade said, taking her hands in his own. "You are not facing this alone. Not anymore. And not ever again, if I have any say in it. Whoever forged that letter wanted to destroy you, Ilara, and by extension, wanted to destroy what we have begun building together. I do not intend to let them succeed." Ilara looked up at him, at the fierce, protective determination in his eyes, and felt something settle deep within her chest, a certainty that had nothing to do with pendants or bloodlines, and everything to do with the steady, unwavering man standing before her. "We need to find proof," she said, "real proof, before whoever did this tries again." "We will," Cade said, "and when we find it, Ilara, I promise you, they will regret ever believing they could tear us apart." Outside the alcove, unseen by either of them, a servant loyal to Priya lingered in the shadows, just long enough to overhear their final words, before slipping away into the darkness, carrying word of the investigation back to a mistress who had already begun planning her next, far more desperate move. Ilse returned to the packhouse grounds herself this time, walking openly through the front gates under the protection Cade had arranged, carrying with her a leather satchel of documents that would finally settle the question hanging over Ilara's fate. The council chamber was fuller than usual for the hearing, word having spread quickly through the pack about the mysterious woman who claimed to hold proof of a Larkspur bloodline hidden within their own ranks. Magda sat at the high table, with an expression of careful neutrality, though the tension in her shoulders betrayed how seriously she had come to regard the matter. Priya stood near the back of the chamber, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly before her in a posture that Ilara, watching closely now for any sign of guilt, recognized immediately as barely contained anxiety. "I served the Larkspur family for nearly 30 years, Ilse said, addressing the council with the calm authority of someone who had waited a long time to speak this truth aloud. "I was there the night the family was attacked, the night most of the bloodline was slaughtered by rivals who feared what a united Larkspur claim could mean for the balance of power across these territories. I helped smuggle the last surviving daughter, Ilara's mother, out of the destruction, and I helped her build a new, hidden life, far from anyone who might recognize her name or her blood." She withdrew documents from her satchel, carefully preserved records bearing the Larkspur seal, birth records, a marriage certificate showing the joining of Ilara's mother to Ilara's father under her true, hidden family name, before she had ever adopted the simpler name the small farming pack had known her by. Alongside these, Ilse produced a second pendant, nearly identical to the one Ilara already carried, explaining that the Larkspur line traditionally gave matching pendants to daughters at their coming of age, one kept and one given to a trusted protector for safekeeping, in case of exactly the kind of danger that had eventually claimed the family. The scribes examined each document with meticulous care, comparing seals and handwriting against older records held within the Ashwood archives, records old enough to predate even Magda's own grandmother's time as Luna. After nearly 2 hours of careful examination, the head scribe rose and addressed the council with a verdict that sent a fresh ripple of astonishment through the assembled crowd. "The documents are authentic," he announced. The seals match confirmed Larkspur records preserved in our own archives from before the Bloodline's destruction. There is no reasonable doubt remaining. Elara Ashwood, born Elara Voss, carries genuine and verifiable Larkspur heritage through her mother's line. The chamber erupted into a wave of murmurs, disbelief mixing now with something that bordered on awe. Elara stood at the center of it all, the weight of the moment settling over her with a strange, disorienting mixture of vindication and uncertainty, aware that the truth she had spent weeks fearing to reveal had finally, undeniably, become impossible to deny. But the head scribe was not finished. Furthermore, he continued, producing a separate document, our examination of the letter previously presented as evidence of treachery has revealed clear signs of forgery. The handwriting does not match any sample of Elara's writing on record within this pack house, and traces of a specific ink blend, imported and expensive, have been identified that match supplies recently purchased through the household accounts of Priya Ashwood. A sharp, collective gasp moved through the chamber, and every eye turned toward Priya, whose face had gone from pale to ashen in the span of a heartbeat. Magda rose slowly from her seat at the high table, her expression a mask of cold, controlled fury, directed now entirely at her niece. "Explain yourself," Magda said, her voice dangerously quiet. "This is absurd," Priya said, though her voice wavered, betraying the confidence she tried desperately to project. "Anyone could have purchased that ink. This proves nothing." "It proves enough to warrant further investigation," Cade said, stepping forward with the same steady authority he had shown throughout the proceedings. "And I believe, once that investigation is complete, it will reveal considerably more than a coincidental ink purchase." He nodded toward two guards stationed near the chamber doors, and within moments, they had moved to flank Priya, their presence making clear that she would not be permitted to leave the hearing without further questioning. Priya's composure finally shattered entirely, her earlier confidence collapsing into something closer to desperation. "I did what was necessary," she said, her voice rising with barely suppressed fury. "I was meant to be Luna. My family has served this pack for generations, sacrificed for it, bled for it, and then this debt-born nobody arrives, marries into a position she never earned, and suddenly everyone forgets what real loyalty looks like. I did what needed to be done to protect this pack from a threat none of you were willing to see." "There was no threat," Cade said, his voice hard. "Only a woman you resented for a position she never sought and never wanted, and a scheme dangerous enough to have started open conflict with Thornfield territory had it succeeded. Tell us, Priya, exactly how deep this scheme runs. Who helped you forge that letter? Who provided you with knowledge of Thornfield activity to make the accusation convincing?" Priya's silence stretched long and heavy through the chamber, but the guilt written plainly across her features answered the question more clearly than words could have. Finally, recognizing that further denial would accomplish nothing, she spoke, her voice small and bitter. "Corin," she said, "a rider from Thornfield. I met with him near the old clearing beyond the eastern fence, weeks ago. He agreed to help me discredit Elara, in exchange for the promise of Thornfield gaining influence within Ashwood leadership, once she was removed, and I took my rightful place as Luna." The revelation sent the chamber into fresh, furious uproar, the elders rising from their seats, voices overlapping in outrage, as the full scope of Priya's betrayal became clear. She had not simply schemed against Elara out of petty jealousy. She had conspired with a rival pack, offered Ashwood influence in exchange for personal ambition, placed the entire territory at risk of war for the sake of a position she believed she deserved. Magda's voice finally cut through the chaos, cold and absolute. "Priya Ashwood, you stand accused of treason against this pack, conspiracy with a hostile rival, and the forgery of evidence intended to see an innocent member of this family cast out, or worse. You will be held under guard until a full tribunal can determine your fate, as pack law requires for crimes of this severity." Priya was led from the chamber, her earlier confidence entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, frightened expression of someone finally confronting the true weight of what her ambition had cost her. The chamber remained in stunned silence, long after she had gone, the elders exchanging uneasy glances, the weight of how close the pack had come to real disaster settling slowly over the room. Magda turned finally to Elara, and for the first time since their initial meeting in the Great Hall weeks earlier, Something in her expression shifted, hard pride giving way, however reluctantly, to something closer to respect. "I owe you an apology," she said, the words clearly difficult for a woman unaccustomed to admitting fault. "I judged you before I ever gave you the chance to prove yourself, and in doing so, I nearly allowed a genuine traitor within our own ranks to succeed, simply because it was easier to believe the worst of a debt-born Omega than to question the ambitions of my own niece. That was a failure of leadership on my part, and I will not pretend otherwise." "Thank you," Elara said quietly, surprised by the sincerity in Magda's voice, though the wound of weeks spent enduring the woman's coldness had not entirely healed. "The Larkspur bloodline," Magda continued, turning to address the full council once more, "carries with it certain rights under Old Pack law, rights that predate even the Ashwood line's own claim to this territory. It would be foolish and dishonest for this council to continue treating Elara as anything less than what the evidence has now proven her to be. A woman of genuine standing, genuine strength, and genuine loyalty, proven not through inherited privilege, but through every difficult day she has endured within these walls, without once breaking." The chamber murmured its agreement, and Elara felt the shift in the air around her, the weight of suspicion and mockery that had followed her since her wedding day finally, slowly, beginning to lift. Cade moved to stand beside her, taking her hand in his without hesitation, and this time, when the assembled pack members looked toward them, there was no laughter in their expressions, only a quiet, dawning recognition of exactly what kind of woman had walked among them these past weeks, unseen and underestimated, until the truth had finally forced them all to look clearly. But even as relief washed through her, Elara could not shake a lingering unease. Priya's scheme had been uncovered, her betrayal exposed, but Corin remained free, and Thornfield's ambitions along the border had not simply vanished with one conspirator's downfall. Somewhere beyond the safety of the packhouse walls, a rival pack still watched Ashwood territory with hungry, calculating eyes, and Elara understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain in her chest, that the true reckoning was far from finished. The horn sounded from the northern watchtower just after sunrise, 3 short blasts that every pack member had been trained since childhood to recognize as the signal for an approaching force. Elara was in the garden when the sound reached her, and she dropped the basket of herbs she had been gathering, her heart lurching as pack warriors began streaming toward the northern border at a dead run, Cade among them, already shouting orders as he moved. She caught his arm before he could pass her entirely. "What is happening?" she asked. "Thornfield," Cade said grimly. "A larger force than we have seen in months, gathering at the border. They must have learned of Priya's capture and decided to act before we could question Corin further and unravel whatever else they had planned." "Let me come," Elara said. "I can help with the wounded, the way I did before." Cade hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Stay behind the front lines. Promise me that." "I promise," Elara said, though even as the words left her mouth, she was not entirely certain she would be able to keep them if the fighting turned as desperate as the tension in Cade's expression suggested it might. They reached the northern border, to find the Thornfield force already advancing, more warriors than Ashwood had anticipated, their front line led by a broad-shouldered wolf, whose bearing marked him clearly as someone accustomed to command. Cade rallied his warriors quickly, forming defensive lines along the natural ridge that marked the territory boundary, and for a tense, breathless moment, the two forces simply stared at one another across the contested ground, neither side willing to make the first move. It was Corin who finally stepped forward from the Thornfield line, no longer disguised as a lone messenger, but standing openly now beside the Thornfield Alpha, his expression carrying the confidence of a man who believed his scheme had already succeeded. "We know of the traitor in your midst," Corin called out. "Priya Ashwood promised us influence within your leadership in exchange for our help. Where is she? Has your council finally seen reason and accepted the terms she negotiated on your behalf?" "Priya Ashwood has been arrested for treason," Cade called back, his voice carrying clearly across the field. "Whatever agreement she believed she was making with your pack died the moment her forgery was exposed. You have no claim here, Corin, and no ally within these walls any longer." A murmur of uncertainty moved through the Thornfield ranks at this news, clearly unexpected, and the Thornfield Alpha, a heavy-set wolf named Garrett, stepped forward with a scowl, exchanging a sharp, questioning glance with Corin. "You told me this arrangement was secure," Garrett said, his voice low, but carrying enough for those nearby to hear the growing tension between the two Thornfield leaders. "It was secure," Corin insisted, though uncertainty had begun to creep into his own voice. "The girl was to be discredited, removed. Priya assured me the council would turn against her entirely." "And yet," Elara said, stepping forward before Cade could stop her, her voice ringing out clear and steady across the contested ground, "the council instead confirmed my heritage as a daughter of the Larkspur line, exposed Priya's scheme for exactly what it was, and now finds itself facing a rival pack that appears to have based its entire invasion on the false promises of a single desperate conspirator. I would ask you to consider carefully, Garrett of Thornfield, whether marching to war on the word of a traitor already in chains is truly the wisest course for your own pack's future." A ripple of surprise moved through both lines at her boldness, and Cade shot her a sharp, worried glance, though he did not order her back, seeming to recognize, even in the tension of the moment, that she had found the precise thread capable of unraveling the fragile alliance holding the Thornfield force together. Garrett studied Elara for a long moment, clearly weighing her words, and Corin's expression had shifted from confidence to open unease as the weight of his failed scheme became apparent before his own alpha and the assembled warriors of both packs. "Is this true?" Garrett demanded, turning on Corin. "You built this entire venture on the promises of a woman already exposed as a traitor to her own pack?" "I believed her claims to be reliable," Corin said, though the excuse sounded thin, even to Elara's ears. "You believed," Garrett repeated, his voice dangerously quiet. "And now you have marched my warriors to the edge of open war against a pack that holds firm leadership and a legitimate claim of ancient bloodline standing, based entirely on the word of a conspirator who could not even secure her own position within her own family." The tension along the Thornfield line shifted visibly, warriors exchanging uncertain glances, the momentum of the invasion beginning to falter under the weight of Garrett's growing doubt. Cade seized the moment, stepping forward himself with the calm, commanding presence that had earned him respect across the northern border for years. "Garrett," he said, "we have no wish for war, and I do not believe you truly wish for one either, not on the strength of a scheme this poorly built. Withdraw your forces now, and I am willing to consider this an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than an act of aggression. Press forward, and you will find Ashwood defenses considerably stronger and considerably more prepared than whatever Priya may have promised your envoy." Garrett's gaze moved between Cade's steady confidence and Corin's crumbling composure, and after a long, tense silence, he finally raised a hand, signaling his warriors to stand down. "Withdraw," he called out, his voice carrying clear command across the field. "We will discuss terms through proper channels, not through the schemes of traitors on either side of this border." The Thornfield line began to retreat, slow and orderly, and Elara felt the tension in her chest finally begin to loosen as the immediate threat of open conflict receded. But Corin, watching his carefully built scheme collapse entirely before his own alpha's eyes, seemed unwilling to accept defeat so easily. In a sudden, desperate movement, he lunged forward, not toward Cade, but toward Elara, a blade flashing in his hand, driven by the fury of a man who had lost everything in a single humiliating moment. Cade moved faster than thought, placing himself between Elara and the blade, with the same instinctive protectiveness that had defined every moment since he had truly begun to see her, catching Corin's wrist and turning the attack aside before it could find its mark. The two men grappled briefly, the ridge erupting into shouts from both sides of the border, until Ashwood warriors moved swiftly to subdue Corin entirely, wresting the blade from his grip and pinning him to the ground before Garrett himself, furious at the reckless violence his own envoy had nearly unleashed, ordered him bound and dragged back toward Thornfield territory in disgrace. "Are you hurt?" Cade asked, turning to Elara immediately, his hands moving over her shoulders and arms, as though checking for injury, despite the fact that Corin's blade had never come close enough to touch her. "I am fine," Elara said, though her heart still pounded from the suddenness of the attack. "You protected me." I will always protect you, Cade said, and the words carried a weight far beyond the immediate danger they had just survived, a promise that seemed to settle something deep and certain between them. As the Thornfield force withdrew fully across the border, and the immediate threat of war receded into the distance, Elara looked around at the Ashwood warriors gathered on the ridge, at their expressions, no longer wary or suspicious, but openly respectful, some even approaching to offer quiet words of gratitude for the way her boldness had helped avert a conflict that could have cost many lives on both sides of the border. You spoke with real authority back there, Cade said as they finally began the walk back toward the pack house, the danger of the morning fading into the golden light of a peaceful afternoon. Like someone born to lead, not someone still trying to prove she belongs. Perhaps, Elara said, I am finally beginning to believe it myself. Behind them, the northern border settled back into its usual quiet, the immediate crisis resolved, though both of them understood, walking together in comfortable silence toward the home that had slowly, painfully, become truly theirs, that the full reckoning of everything Priya's betrayal had set in motion was still waiting to be settled within the walls of the Ashwood packhouse itself. The tribunal chamber was packed to its very edges. The morning Priya was brought before the full pack council to answer for her betrayal. Every seat filled, every wall lined with pack members, eager to witness the final reckoning of a scandal that had, in the span of a few short weeks, nearly cost the entire territory a war. Priya stood before the high table in plain clothing, stripped of the fine dresses and confident bearing that had once marked her as one of the pack's most prominent daughters. Her face was pale, her eyes downcast, though occasionally she glanced up toward Magda with an expression that seemed to search, desperately and in vain, for some flicker of family loyalty that might yet save her from the full weight of pack law. Priya Ashwood, Magda said, her voice carrying none of the warmth that might once have softened the proceedings for a member of her own extended family. You stand accused of forging evidence against an innocent member of this pack, of conspiring with rival territory leadership against Ashwood interests, and of nearly instigating open war through your own selfish ambition. How do you answer these charges? For a long moment, Priya said nothing, the silence stretching heavy and uncomfortable through the crowded chamber. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than anyone had ever heard it, stripped of the sharp confidence that had defined her since Elara's arrival. I answer that I was wrong, she said. I let jealousy convince me that ambition mattered more than loyalty, more than the safety of this pack. I told myself I deserved the position of Luna, that Elara had stolen something that should rightfully have been mine, and I let that belief poison every decision I made afterward. I do not ask for mercy. I only wish the council to understand that my anger, however wrong, was never truly about hatred for Elara herself, but about years of feeling overlooked, feeling as though my own worth was never enough to earn the recognition I craved. A murmur moved through the chamber, some sympathetic, others clearly unmoved by an explanation that, however honest, did not erase the danger her actions had nearly unleashed. Elara, seated near the front of the chamber beside Cade, found herself studying Priya's bowed head with an unexpected mixture of feelings, anger at the danger she had caused, but also, surprisingly, a flicker of understanding for the loneliness and resentment that had clearly festered beneath Priya's cruelty from the very beginning. Ambition is not itself a crime, Magda said finally, but the choices you made in service of it very nearly were the ruin of this entire pack. Corin has already confessed everything under Thornfield's own questioning, confirming every detail of your arrangement, from the forged letter to the promise of influence within our leadership. There is no path remaining to deny your guilt, only to determine the manner of your punishment. The council deliberated for what felt to Elara like an eternity, murmured voices rising and falling among the elders, as they weighed the severity of Priya's crimes against the mitigating honesty of her final confession. Finally, Magda rose to deliver the tribunal's judgment. Priya Ashwood, you are stripped of your standing within this family's inner council, effective immediately and permanently. You will serve a period of exile from Ashwood territory, no less than 5 years, during which time you will have the opportunity to reflect on the true cost of ambition, pursued without regard for loyalty or truth. Should you wish to return after this period, you may petition the council for reconsideration, though no guarantee of acceptance will be offered. This judgment is final. Priya received the verdict with quiet, resigned acceptance, offering no further argument, and as the guards moved to escort her from the chamber to begin preparations for her exile, she paused briefly before Elara, her expression carrying something that looked, unmistakably, like genuine remorse. "I was wrong about you," Priya said quietly, low enough that only Elara could hear. "I convinced myself you were nothing more than a debt-given human shape, easy to dismiss, easy to discard. I see now how wrong I was, and I am sorry, for whatever that is worth after everything I have done." "It is worth something," Elara said, surprising herself with the sincerity of the response. "I hope you find, wherever you go next, whatever it is you have been searching for all along." Priya nodded once, something in her posture softening slightly at the unexpected kindness, before the guards led her from the chamber and out of Ashwood territory entirely, beginning the long years of exile that would, in their own painful way, offer her the chance to rebuild herself into someone far removed from the bitter, scheming woman who had nearly torn the pack apart. With Priya's fate settled, and Corin's confession fully unraveling the danger Thornfield had posed, the immediate crisis facing the Ashwood pack finally, truly began to resolve. But for Elara, the resolution of the tribunal brought with it an unexpected new challenge, one she had not fully anticipated in the whirlwind of accusations, confrontations, and near war that had consumed the past several weeks. With her Larkspur heritage now fully confirmed and publicly acknowledged, whispers had begun moving through the pack about what her bloodline truly meant for her future standing. Some among the elders spoke openly of the ancient rights the Larkspur line carried, rights that, in some interpretations of old pack law, could entitle her to claims and authority independent of her marriage to Cade entirely. It was a conversation that unsettled Elara more than she expected, stirring uncertainty about what her place within the pack and within her marriage truly meant now that the world knew her as something far greater than the debt-born Omega they had once mocked. "You seem troubled again," Cade observed one evening, finding her in the garden where she had first admitted the truth of Ilsa's revelation to him weeks earlier. The irony of returning to this same quiet space, now with so much having changed, was not lost on either of them. "The elders keep speaking of Larkspur rights," Elara admitted, "as though my bloodline changes the entire foundation of who I am within this pack. I do not know how to feel about it. For so long I was nothing, and now suddenly I am meant to be something extraordinary, and I fear the pack's expectations of me have shifted faster than I have had time to understand myself." Cade sat beside her on the low garden wall, taking her hand gently in his own. "Then let us understand it together," he said. "You are not required to become anyone other than who you already are, simply because the pack has finally recognized your worth. The bloodline is part of your history, Elara, an important part, but it is not the whole of you. The woman who stitched my wound without flinching, who defended a frightened boy's honesty before this entire pack, who stood boldly between two armies and turned the tide of a possible war with nothing but her own steady voice. That woman was already extraordinary, long before anyone knew the name Larkspur belonged to her." Elara felt tears prick at the edges of her eyes, unexpected and overwhelming, the accumulated weight of weeks of fear and uncertainty finally beginning to release under the gentle honesty of his words. "I love you," she said quietly, the words slipping free before she had fully decided to speak them, surprising herself with how naturally true they felt once spoken aloud. Cade's expression shifted into something soft and unguarded, an emotion she had rarely seen cross his face in all the weeks since their wedding. "I love you too," he said. "I think I have for longer than I allowed myself to admit, since long before either of us understood what this marriage would truly become." They sat together in the quiet garden as the evening settled softly around them, the immediate dangers of Priya's betrayal and Thornfield's aggression finally resolved, replaced by a new, quieter kind of certainty, the understanding that whatever challenges still lay ahead in learning to navigate Elara's newly recognized standing within the pack, they would face them together, as true partners, in a marriage that had begun in humiliation and debt, and had grown, against every expectation the pack once held, into something genuine, steady, and strong. The great hall had been transformed by the time Elara arrived on the morning of the formal ceremony. The same cold stone chamber where she had once stood with a blade at her throat, now draped in banners of deep green and silver, the colors chosen to honor both the Ashwood pack and the newly restored Larkspur line she carried within her blood. It had been 2 months since the tribunal that sent Priya into exile, 2 months of careful work rebuilding trust between Ashwood and Thornfield territories through proper diplomatic channels rather than the schemes of desperate conspirators. 2 months of Elara slowly settling into a role within the pack that no longer felt borrowed or uncertain, but genuinely, undeniably her own. Today, the council had gathered the entire pack to formally recognize what the tribunal's investigation had already confirmed months earlier, that Elara Ashwood, born of the Larkspur line, would be recognized not merely as the Alpha heir's wife, but as a true Luna of the pack in her own right, her standing earned through demonstrated strength, wisdom, and loyalty rather than inherited privilege alone. Elara stood at the entrance of the great hall, dressed not in the plain gray servant's garment she had worn to her wedding, but in a gown of deep green silk, the Larkspur pendant resting openly at her throat for the first time before the assembled pack, no longer a secret to be hidden, but a symbol to be claimed. She thought, standing there, and remembering the humiliation of that first walk down this very aisle, how impossibly far she had traveled in the months since, how the same hall that had once echoed with mocking laughter now waited in respectful, anticipatory silence. Cade waited for her at the far end of the hall, standing beside his mother at the high table, his expression carrying none of the cold indifference of their wedding day, replaced instead by open, unguarded pride as he watched her walk toward him. This time, the pack did not merely watch her pass. As she walked, one by one, the gathered wolves began to bow their heads, a wave of quiet respect moving through the hall like a current, spreading from those nearest the entrance all the way to the high table itself, until every single member of the Ashwood pack stood with heads lowered, in recognition of the woman they had once dismissed as nothing more than a debt given human shape. Elara felt tears gathering at the edges of her eyes as she walked, not from sorrow this time, but from the overwhelming weight of a moment she had never truly allowed herself to imagine possible during those cold, lonely weeks of scrubbing floors and enduring whispered cruelty. She thought of her father, who had died believing his family's debt would haunt her forever, and hoped, somehow, that he could see this moment, could know that the daughter he had worried over so deeply had found not just survival, but genuine belonging. She thought of Ilsa, who had risked her own safety to bring the truth of the Larkspur line out of hiding after so many years of careful silence, and made a quiet promise to seek her out again soon, to ensure the woman who had changed everything received whatever gratitude and protection Ashwood territory could offer in return. She thought, too, of Priya, somewhere beginning the long years of her exile, and felt, surprisingly, not triumph at her downfall, but a quiet hope that the woman might someday find her way to the kind of genuine peace that jealousy and ambition had never been able to provide her. Reaching the high table, Elara stood before Magda, who studied her for a long moment before speaking, her voice carrying clearly through the silent, bowed hall. 2 months ago, Magda said, this pack witnessed a wedding built on debt and obligation, a union many among us believed to be doomed from its very first vow. We were wrong, not only about the strength of this marriage, but about the strength of the woman who stood at that altar despite our mockery, despite our cruelty, despite every reason we gave her to break. Elara Ashwood has proven herself, again and again, through courage in crisis, through wisdom in judgment, through loyalty that never wavered, even when this pack gave her no reason to offer it. Today, this council formally recognizes her not as an obligation fulfilled, but as a true Luna of the Ashwood pack, chosen not by circumstance, but by every quality that makes a leader worthy of the title. The hall erupted into applause, genuine and warm, entirely unlike the hollow, performative clapping that had followed Elara's wedding vows 2 months earlier. Cade stepped forward, taking both of Elara's hands in his own, his eyes bright with an emotion he no longer bothered to hide before the assembled pack. I told you once that this marriage began as something neither of us chose, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, though the words felt intimate, meant only for her, despite the audience surrounding them. I want the whole of this pack to hear me say clearly, now that I choose you, Elara, not out of debt, not out of obligation, but because you are the finest partner and the finest leader I could have ever hoped to stand beside. Whatever comes next for this pack, I want to face it with you, exactly as we have faced everything since the day you stitched my wound and refused to let fear stop your hands from steady work." Elara laughed through the tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks, the sound bright and unguarded in a way she had rarely allowed herself since her father's death. "I choose you too," she said, "every single day, for as long as we both shall lead this pack together." The formal ceremony continued through the afternoon, the pack sharing food and celebration in a manner far removed from the cold, mocking spectacle of the wedding months earlier. Young pack members approached Elara throughout the day, offering shy words of admiration, some recalling the way she had calmly tended wounds after the border skirmish, others speaking of her bold words that had turned back the Thornfield invasion before it could claim a single life. The same wolves who had once laughed openly at her plain gray dress now sought her counsel, her approval, her quiet, steady wisdom that had proven itself far more valuable than any inherited privilege the pack had originally expected from its leadership. As evening fell and the celebration began to wind down, Elara found herself standing once more at the top of the great hall's stone steps, exactly where she and Cade had stood together on the morning of their wedding. The mist that had once clung to the hills long since burned away by the warm golden light of a peaceful, settled dusk. "Do you remember what you said to me here?" Cade asked, coming to stand beside her, "on the day we married?" "I said this was not my choice," Elara answered, smiling faintly at the memory. "And you agreed it was not yours either." "I would choose you again," Cade said, 1,000 times over, knowing everything I know now. The debt that brought you to this pack turned out to be the greatest gift Ashwood territory has ever received, though it took all of us far too long to recognize it. Elara leaned into him, watching the last light of the day settle gently over the hills that had once seemed so cold and unwelcoming, now warm with the promise of a future she had never dared to imagine during those difficult, lonely weeks of her arrival. Behind them, the great hall still glowed with lantern light and the fading sounds of celebration, a pack finally united, finally whole, led by a Luna who had proven, beyond any doubt, that true worth was never measured by the debts a person carried into a room, but by the strength, courage, and unwavering heart they carried out of it. The girl the pack had once laughed at now stood as their Luna, respected, beloved, and utterly unbreakable. And as the first stars of the evening began to appear above the Ashwood pack house, Elara understood, with quiet and complete certainty, that whatever challenges the future might still hold, she would meet them exactly as she had met everything before, standing tall, standing steady, and never, ever standing alone.